This is Jamie Dyer welcoming you to another edition of the Quo-Cast, and I'm joined by Iain White. How are you doing, Iain?
Oh yeah, Jamie, I'm good. Yeah, nice to see it. It's a very hot Sunday here, but good to talk about some hot music, some hot rocking music, which we're going to talk about later.
The Hello album, released 50 years ago. What are your memories of that album, Iain?
Wow, I can't. Even though I'm looking at the stats myself, I can't believe it's 50 years ago. Oh my God. My memories of Hello are obviously a long time ago. I'm 50 years old myself now, but I didn't hear this album until I was probably 14 or 15. So it'd be about 1985, six, around that sort of time. And I remember listening to this. I got into Quo after hearing or watching End of the Road on the TV, 84, or whenever it was released on the TV, perhaps a year later, 85. And then I took a deep dive into all things Quo. And I particularly remember buying, having Pile Driver bought for me for Christmas. And then I bought all the other albums. So talking about Hello, I remember distinctly listening to this in my mom's house. And at the time, I remember she had a stereo, and it was in weirdly the stereo was in one room, and drilled a hole through the wall to put the speaker cables through. And used to listen to the speakers were actually in the kitchen. So I remember sitting in the kitchen, and like things like family parties and stuff, and I'd be having, in particular, I used to listen to Quo and pretty much AC/DC all the time. So I'd either have Hello on or on the level, pretty much after school, before school, all day, every day. And one thing I do remember is listen to Hello, just all the sort of the moms at the time, the grown-ups in inverted brackets, sort of coming and saying, can't you turn this noise down? And I just thought it was just the most brilliant, sort of heavy but melodic, swinging music. I thought it was fantastic.
And that's exactly what it is, because you've got the bluesy element that they had in their earlier albums, plus this country element coming in with things like Claudie, even Blue Eyed Lady, Caroline have sort of country at their roots. When you're playing this album now, do your thoughts differ? Has your view changed over the years?
That's a really good question, because today, in preparation for our interview, I thought I'll listen to it again in its entirety. And because I've known the song so long, I'm just going to backtrack a tiny little bit. I'm going to preface this with, because I played in tribute bands for a long time, and I've been a professional musician before. I'm not saying it like as a boast, but I've got a degree in music, so I do know what I'm talking about in terms of theory. And I'm going to. Well, the reason I say that is I'm going to reference quite a lot of theory that Ross Imperfect play and Lancaster, which people might not be aware of. How clever the arrangements were, whether they were conscious of doing it or not. So to answer your question, I listened to it again today in its entirety, and I was honestly just generally blown away. It was the track listings, for example, like starts off Roll Over Lay Down. It's got the dirtiest, the gnarliest, that bass. I'm sure it's Lancaster's bass. It seems to have like a low octave on it. It's got a bit of drive and distortion on the bass. And it's really heavy intro. I've never heard it, even when Quo play it in relatively recent times with Rhino on bass. It's never sounded quite as heavy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Intro. When I saw them on the reunion tour when they played Roll Over Lay Down, it had that drive and that dirt again when Lancaster played it. And then going to Claudie, you're right, it had that's got that really lovely sort of country influence, and they're playing really nice harmonies, Ross and Parfitt together, which people obviously the detractors think they only know three chords, which we all know is rubbish, really. But they're really, really clever little. And I mean, it's only a three-chord song, but they make it sound so interesting with the way they play the chords. And one thing that quoted that people don't give them credit for is they don't have a lot of overdrive on the albums, particularly in the early ones. People think overdrive makes things heavy, but what it does, it compresses the sound. What they did brilliantly was they played cleaner sounding amps, but they played it really loud, and they played them really hard, particularly Parfit. And it gave this really big, wide, open, dynamic sound. So yeah, Claude is obviously got a really lovely country element to it. And I don't know how long you want to go on a deep dive on this, but I could talk forever. Something I'm really fond of, particularly in the early albums, probably up to about Just Supposing, was Rossi's lead guitar playing was very, very, very chordal based, very triad based. So what I mean by that is rather than playing up and down scales very quickly, he would pick out specific notes. So if you take it's like Claudia, for example, in the guitar solo, he starts off with a bluesy sort of bend, and then he goes into the da 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 da. He's picking out the major third and the root with the sixth, and then the sixth part, and he follows that with the chords. It just gives this really bright sound. Do you know the part I'm talking about?
Yes.
So he really follows the chords. It's called playing the changes, is what they call it in music theory. Which yeah, people would probably be surprised he has that sort of knowledge, or maybe surprised he has that knowledge. Then we go into Reason for Living, and it honestly was just such a joy to it because I know these tracks backwards. I've played them to death. I know every part of them, but just to hear them, not in a different order because the album is the album. But I haven't listened to the album for a few years. Go from Claudine to Reason for Living, that really heavy Parfit bit at the start. One thing that really struck me about Reason for Living was when you look at the lyrics, Quo weren't really known for being a particularly how would you put it, in-depth band in terms of lyrics. It was never very, political, or there's no political statement. But Reason for Living is very heavy on the religion,
Yeah.
talking to the maker, and they've never, I don't think they've ever repeated since, actually, have they?
Not really. No, not that I can think of. I mean, they've done sort of almost war type things, things that feel, I mean, obviously in the army now and the like. But yeah, you're right. In terms of religion and similar, they don't tend to go along those lines.
No. So yeah, I hope you don't mind, Jamie, if I take a bit of a analytical approach on the guitar work as well when we're talking about it, if that's okay.
That is absolutely fine. It's fascinating because I play guitar as well, but not nearly to the level of which I don't have a degree in that subject. That is, certainly when you listen to this album, you might be forgiven for thinking it's quite basic in the way the songs are composed, even in the recording, because I think they literally just used to rock up, plug their amps in, and off they went. But you did make a point there that obviously Rossi knew more than perhaps people realize, and you might be forgiven for thinking the other way if you heard him 2 or 3 albums previously on tracks like Lucky Lady, where it's he almost sounds unsure in his solo work. So for him to come along that far in such a short space of time is quite impressive.
It is. You're right. He was almost sounded like, say, unsure, unconfident as a lead guitar player. I think he has gone on record as saying he never really wanted to be. He didn't want to be a Angus Young or a Paul Gilbert type guitar player. He was happy just to sort of write songs and good melodies, but obviously he had the talent. To play the lead stuff. So Reason for Living is a very interesting one. So another classic example of what Quo do brilliantly, which people don't take credit for. They think they're just these 2 guitars grinding away, and they have done that in past. But Reason for Living is a great example. I'll talk about in a second. Things like Backwater, and we'll talk about 4,500 times later, and Softer Ride. Well, they have 2 distinct parts. So when the verse kicks in Reason for Living, you've got the very heavy, it's a low F power chord that Parfit's playing, and then Rossi's playing an accented, an upstroke on the offbeat on the same chord, but it's a lot higher in the register. So you get this real counterpoint of the real low chug and the kind of the high accented da 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 da. While you've got the so you got the straight fours going on and the accented offbeats. And what it does, it creates, again, we're talking about dynamics. They can make a relatively simple blues song sound exciting because they're not just playing the same parts; they're playing different registers. So your ears picking up a very low part, and also the high part of the accent, like an upstroke, if that makes sense. Backwater's another good example of that. When the riff comes in, you've got Parfit doing the dead, 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 and Rossi's playing the power chords. If you've ever thought about that, and it just creates this really wide, dynamic stereo sound, and that's why it's hard to really sound like them.
And Mean Girl is obviously another example of playing, well, in that case, they're playing two versions of the same chord, aren't they? One low and one high.
Yeah, yeah,
It's interesting that you should mention this, but one thing in these early recordings, maybe Hello, Quo, perhaps on the level, is that you do have this thing where Rossi and Parfit, and even Lancaster to a point, are playing parts that complement each other. And I don't think there's any other track on this album, apart from 4,500 Times, where this is more evident than in Blue Eyed Lady.
oh, absolutely. Blue. I mean, I was going to talk. I was going to wax lyrical about Blue Eyed Lady. You've got the chord. I mean, just the chords. You mentioned earlier about how they used to turn up and rock up and just plug in and go. Well, I can imagine they must have. They must, and I know they rehearsed the recording of Blue Eyed Lady, because there's some really interesting chords in there. I just want to quickly go back to Reason for Living, because something that's really interesting that doesn't happen very often is on that track, you've got two guitar solos.
Yeah.
Is Rick Parfitt, and it's got he. I don't know if he ever play. He sounds like he's playing like a slide. He's got a very linear approach. He plays. He doesn't bend very much. He doesn't play sort of fast scales, but he plays very like on a single on one string. But he'll keep on the one string, but go up and down the neck, if that makes sense, rather than going across the neck in a scale fashion. It gives this really, I can't think of the word I'm trying to describe it. It gives a very direct and linear approach, very like da 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 da. Where then after in the second solo, you can hear it's Rossi with more soulful bluesy bends. I think that's really interesting. The only other time I've heard it is on "Let Me Fly" when Parfit does a solo on that, and they do a harmony at the end as well. And they don't do it enough. Parfit was a damn good guitar player. He wasn't. His solo wasn't used enough, but it's done to really good effect on "Reason for Living." Do you know the parts I mean?
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
because I heard Big Fat Mama at the convention last year doing that track, and I was waiting for the slide, and I was not disappointed.
No,
So yeah, it's an integral part. It's one of the most memorable parts to me. That particular moment you're talking about, because it kind of goes into the chugging after that, doesn't it? Into the second verse.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think that's it's. I mean, it's a great song anyway. But then they just again they're applying their skills and their techniques in very specific ways to catch the listener's eye. But you get onto Blue Eyed Lady. It's interesting actually. Blue Eyed Lady for a long time, and I can play sort of complicated licks. I'm really into Steve Vai and Paul Gilbert and these sort of people. Blue Eyed Lady, the intro lick had me stumbling over it for a long time until I saw them play it on the reunion tour, and I found out. So actually, watching Rossi, he made a quite a difficult lick. He made it a difficult sounding lick. He played it very easily, and it's only watching him figured out how he's playing it. So the Blue Eyed Lady's got this really great mixed Lydian C coordinate. But we talked about earlier on about the chords they were talking about. In this song, they use diminished chords. Diminished chord is a flattened third and a flattened fifth. But again, you said to somebody, Status Quo use diminished chords, they're probably quite surprised. So Blue Eyed Lady's got one of the great intros, and again another example of the two different parts, as you mentioned earlier, like Mean Girl. You got the low, it's in the key of A. You got the low chug and then a very high register doing the same part to give this really bright, sort of almost like a thrashy dimension to it. And you get into the guitar solo, and it just goes up to another dimension. Say in the solo, this adds in the diminished chords, which gives it real tension for a second. Then it releases it. So it's a really classic example of tension and release. Fantastic song along. I love everything about the lyrics. The guitar solo that's so heavy, but again tuneful.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Something I mentioned about is the track listing on this album that really not surprised me, because I knew it was going to come. But when you think of Quo, you think of Caroline. It's always the start of the gig, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's always the start of the gig. You get midway through the album, Blue Eyed Lady finishes, and then you hit that absolute sledgehammer of Caroline. And I must have heard Caroline, and I'm not exaggerating, 300 times, 500. I must have played it 500 times. And it still puts a smile on my face today. I never skip it. There's some tracks you've heard, Rock of the World for me is one I've got a bit of fatigue on, for example, or I've heard it 1,000 times. But Caroline coming in the middle of this album, it sounded so heavy but bright and full of drive and enthusiasm. I thought the track listing was just genius. How each track is just they're kind of slightly different, but they're kind of in the same style, and each one just it's just like hit after hit after hit. So Caroline is just obviously a Quo classic, and again another really clever use of harmony, where at the start Ross is playing an F major lick over the F chord. When Parfit goes down to the B flat, Rossi plays a minor third, which is an A flat in it, which is from the B flat dominant scale. So really clever use of chords and lead playing. Obviously, it's a very tight and very simple lead pattern, but it fits the track absolutely perfectly. You couldn't imagine anything else being played in there.
Well, no.
It's interesting on this. When I listen to, because the album I've got is the original album, then when I listen to it on Spotify, it must be some sort of deluxe album. So on it, it's got some Caroline demos, which I'd never heard before, actually, which were just sort of Rossi singing to a drum machine, I think.
Yeah, there's like a fast demo. It's like dung ding dung ding dung da da, and then there's sort of a slow bluesy demo that was later kind of made into the Francis Rossi solo version, which it was quite funny with that really, because that song is so identifiable with Quo, and Rossi was like, well, of course I can start my own gig with it. Why not? But to reinvent it like that, but it's not really. The Quo version is the reinvention, really. Do you think they played that song better in later years when perhaps it was sped up a little bit and they added extra elements that, of course, made it into the riffs version?
I think with all things Quo, you can always say the golden period is always 68 to 84, really. So to answer your question, no, I don't think it was. When it's faster, it loses its groove, it loses its heaviness. I'm a big fan of playing slowly. A band that I really like, for example, is a band called Pantera, who are like they're called a groove metal band, and these to get the real weight in the grunt, it has to have that real that slow. So having groove and rhythm and meter and swing, which Quo have. You can only get when it's below a certain tempo. Well, you can't only get it, but it sounds better at a slightly slow tempo. So to answer your question, the slightly slower, heavier version sounds better to me. Obviously, in later versions, you had the twinkle of the piano, which I'd made a note of to say on here as well. The piano later version. So I like the straight ahead heavy rock version of 73. It's interesting because on this album, I think this was the first album that Andy Bound played on, if I'm right in thinking. He was a kind of a permanent member after this one, is that right?
Well, he didn't join until 82 as an official member, but he did play, I think, as far back as 73.
Yeah. So you only really hear, to my ears, you can only really hear him on 4500. So oh, they've got a piano player in the band. Because I think he might have been on stage from about 77 onwards, perhaps Rocking Over the World around that time, probably a bit more prominent.
So according to what I've got in front of me, Andy Bound plays piano on Blue Eyed Lady, and John Mealing plays piano on 4500 Times.
Oh, right, okay.
So yeah, just session musicians at this point. I think it's interesting actually, because a couple of albums previously, they were without Roy Lines for the first time, and so it's kind of interesting that they still felt like they needed those elements of piano or organ in their music.
Yeah, they still always wanted to. Well, it's obviously Ross's influences, and he still wanted melody was his main thing. A good song is a good song, whether it's got a chord on it, lead guitar, it's heavy rock. It's a good song is a good song. So they always facilitated that with whatever instrumentation they needed. A good contrast that is something I'll talk about later with that song Joanne, which is quite a departure from this album. So Caroline is just, I mean, if someone said to you what is Status Quo in one word, you put that on and you go, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
It's 0 to 100 mile an hour, and it's tuneful, it's heavy, it swings, it rocks, it's over and done, and you got a smiling face and you never get bored of it. Which moves on to Softer Ride, Again with you finish Caroline, you go straight to that, and there's what I noticed on this album as well. There's no gaps. It's like yeah, like a second later and softer. Right, it's almost like the perfect gig planned out for you. You got that really nice slow intro, and this is a great example. I mean, masterful example of building dynamics in a band or a gig. We got the really nice the slow intro. So intro starts with the harmony guitar. Sorry, I'm thinking of Blue Old Lady. I'm getting confused. Blue Old Lady. Um, I want to go back and talk about. I was thinking of Blue Eyed Lady then for a second. I want to very quickly go back. I'm going all over the place here. The intro to Blue Eyed Lady is a really, really quite an exotic scale. They're using it. They harmonise themselves in fourths, and it goes up in a diminished scale at the end. Pardon me. For some reason I thought that was the intro to Soft Ride. I was getting excited listening to it. So again, yeah, sorry, Blue Eyed Lady to finish that off was another example of really, really quite complicated guitar playing, put together in a really memorable fashion. So yeah, I was talking about Softer Ride. Softer Ride, great intro again with the nice soft intro. Then the explosion of in this one the guitars work in tandem. They play this effectively double at the same notes. And starts off the riff with a nice slow offbeat pattern before the main chug, the main sort of shuffle comes in, and just doesn't stop up from there. Absolutely fantastic. Great solo again from Rossi. Again, exactly what the song needs. What he did in these earlier albums and what he didn't do later. When I'm talking later, I mean really modern music. I mentioned before about having not much distortion on the guitars. He used to play quite clean in a country way, but with a lot of attack. What he did later, which I didn't like so much, especially things like the last album, for example, or Search the Fourth Chord as an example, a lot more overdrive and more kind of blues scales. Not as memorable, basically. On this album, everything is memorable. You could whistle every solo, couldn't you, on this album?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of the connecting parts of Softer Ride. The fact that, like you say, that intro, which is very understated and very fun to play on guitar as well.
Yeah.
And it sort of goes da 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 da, and you think, okay, they've done the intro, that's pretty much it. But then during the solo, while the solo's going on, it kind of calls back to it by going da 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 da, and it's like, wow, like
Yeah.
most bands, I feel if they were writing this would have just left the intro part in the intro, but the fact they kept calling back to it, and certainly with that first part, the ding 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 ding, and that you've got that mixed with some sort of 12-bar-y stuff in the middle. It's really like you say, really memorable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it harks back to again to what I was talking about with talking about rehearsing and arrangements. They did well, I wasn't there, but they must have spent a long time putting these arrangements together. You don't just This isn't just three chord winging it and just turn the guitars up and go for it. This is pre-organized, worked out parts that complement each other, that work together fantastically, and they work. And ultimately, what Quo do brilliantly is every part has to work for the song. Yeah, the song is king. The song is king. Whether it's a solo, an intro, an outro, it all, like say, harks back, and they always pull some sort of reprise back to either an intro or an outro, and they make the song memorable because these parts come back to you. Again, there's not much better example of that. I mean, this whole album is just, if you want to make an interest, not just a rock album, but a memorable, interesting, dynamic, loud, heavy, light, slow, quick rock country album. Hello is an absolute masterclass in that for any young rock band, I would say.
Definitely. To go onto the album cover for a moment, it's funny how lo-fi that is.
Yeah. Yeah, and how amazing how you're talking 1973, they used this then. And then on the tour, what was that? When was that? 2000? Oh my God, that's 10 years. So 40 years later, that was the backdrop.
Yeah.
A gig 40 years later. It's just so identifiable. With like, obviously we know them well. We can tell exactly who's who. One thing I always found that's really strange, just talking about, just again me being a guitar nerd. Second person in is Rossi, as far as I'm concerned. That is Francis Rossi. Just the guitar shed. I don't know if you can see. It looks like he's not holding a Telecaster. The guitar looks like like a Gibson 335 or something because it looks quite a big. The body comes up quite high. I might be looking into it too much, but it doesn't look like he's holding a Telecaster. Not that it really matters, but yeah, it's like the absolute classic pose, isn't it?
Well, at this point, they were playing a lot of like Gibsons and stuff like that, like you point out. Certainly in 73, 74, I feel like Rick didn't get his trademark Telecaster until 74.
Yeah, he was using, an SG, wasn't he? A Gibson SG for as early years.
That's right, because in the recent clip that came out from the Midnight Special from a year after this album came out, 6 months to a year, he's playing a Gibson rather than the Telly.
Yeah, yeah, he is. And I did like that sound actually because it had a juxtaposition with Rossi's Telecast. I did quite like it, and it sounds like that sort of really because the humbucker pickup gives it a really thicker sort of crunchier sound, and it sounds like, for example, as an example, Caroline or start to Reason for Living. That's exactly the sort of guitar that would be played on. I mean, he sounded brilliant on Telecaster as well, obviously.
Yeah.
So yeah, softer ride, and then Joe, I hadn't listened to it, and it's better now for a long time.
It's a track I always skipped whenever I listen
Yeah,
to the album because it just feels like a callback to it feels like a psychedelic like cast off that they've somehow like managed to bring into what they were doing.
I agree. I mean, when I was listening to it, I sort of made some mental notes in my head, and it's very brave, really, because you've got this pretty much balls out rocker, of an album, and then this. It seemed it's almost like proggy. It was almost had a Pink Floydy sort of element to it. There's very odd elements, and there's da 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 da, and the bass is just there's offset. The rhythm is just slightly off, and they're doing harmonies which are not what you call a normal harmony, like a third or a fifth. There's like fourths and sixths, which is quite clever, but doesn't really to go against what I said earlier. It doesn't. It's memorable, but not really for me memorable in the right way. It's a track. It was interesting to listen to again, but I probably wouldn't rush to listen to it again. But I thought it was very brave how they were happy to. Well, this is the song we're doing. This is the way we're going to do it. These are the arrangements. I'm going to put it on this album. This is where we are now, and it just shows how, to anybody that, I mean, people listening to this podcast are probably going to be Quo fans, but just go show they have a lot more diverse music than people gave credit for, and It's Better Now is a good example of that.
I think so because, like you say, that those sort of solo-y melodic sections in the middle, I might be misremembering, but I feel like on one of and this shows that they weren't using a click track or anything. On one of the sections, I feel like the bass comes in just a tiny bit later, and I don't know whether that was intentional or whether it's a timing issue.
It's interesting because that's what I picked up on, and if it had been like you say on a click track and it was perfectly played, we probably wouldn't be talking about it. I wouldn't remember it, but I remember it fondly. It's kind of a bit of, I suppose you can call it a wrong note or a wrong timing. It's kind of that grease running between the tracks. It gives it a little bit of character and a bit of charm, almost being in inverted brackets wrong. But yeah, probably I suppose if the album had a skip, it would be It's Better Now for me. I remember listening to it back in the day and thinking, I mean, at that time, all I wanted from Quo was just rock, rock, rock. I wanted long hair, heavy guitars, loud amps. That's all. And It's Better Now is not that. So I did listen to it, and it was interesting. And now I can constructively analyze it and find it a lot more interesting than I thought it was back in the day. But soon I was happy for 4500 times to come along and take its place.
Yes, I would imagine there are a lot of records out there, a lot of copies of this album that have giant dents in them where they've taken it off just as And It's Better Now is starting and trying to find the beginning of 4500 times.
Yeah, a big chunk. Yeah, I think you mean a big chunk out of the wax as they drop it onto the 4500 times. I mean, 4500 times in where, I mean, this has gone down in the annals of rock history. I mean, from what is a relatively simple song structure. I mean, it's had a life of its own. It's been extended to 20 minutes, at the end of the road, and in 1982 shows, it's always requested at tribute gigs by the fans, the hardcore fans. It's requested at the reunion shows. Don't think they played it, did they? Did they play it at the reunion shows? I can't
They
remember.
did, yes. I feel like 2013 they played what you might call the modern
Yeah,
interpretation of
yeah,
it, with where it segs into Rain, and then in the
Rain.
second year, which I wish I'd seen because it was amazing from what I see on film, they added bits to 4500 times that hadn't been played in decades, and then but certainly by that band, things that you associated with them, and it went into Gotta Go Home.
That was it. Because I did go to both years on that tour in Wolverhampton, and the second year was probably one of the best gigs I've ever. Forget Quo, just rock gigs, live gigs I've ever seen. They were so much better. And like you say, that I do remember it now. The "Gotta Go Home" riff. I remember apart from that, when he had this leather jacket done up really tight, he was sweating like crazy. He had the same jacket on every night. But I remember, apart from all the guitar playing, that's one thing I do remember, him looking like he's going to lose about 2 kilos of body weight every night. But 4,500 times then, this is again another example of fantastic guitar parts worked out separately, played brilliantly. I think part of it on this one, he has so I've always done the Rossi parts. I've never actually looked into as close as I should, but I'm pretty sure he's got a low B on his guitar. So you have this real drone, like almost like a bass string on the intro to he's got a very nice arpeggiated light intro, but when he comes to when the band really kicks in, he's got a low B instead of an A, or he might be an F sharp. I'm not sure. I think it's a B, to give this real low, heavy drone, similar to how he does on Whatever You Want, that type of thing, but even lower and heavier.
Yeah, this is, like you say, one of Quo's most recognizable tracks, even to non-fans. I think it's just so epic in the way in which it was constructed, but it feels like a jam, but it probably isn't. It's probably all worked out in advance. What I would say is I feel like the live versions took these parts to another level. Certainly when I've listened to this version, there is almost that uncertainty because it's a jam type situation. Like they don't always sound so confident with some of the parts as they would later. Certainly if you compare it to something like the Rock Till You Drop version.
Yeah, I do love that version actually. I think that's a great version because he does put some extra bits in there. He put some really cool bits in on the Rock Till You Drop version with them. Reminds me very much of Angus Young, the open B, like that sort of stuff. Some nice arpeggios he moves up and down the major and minor scale. But yeah, go back to 4,500 times then. So what you mentioned about the jam, one thing I think is absolutely a beautiful segue in this, when it starts off, it's very straight. It's not a swung rhythm or meter on it, and how they go into when the solo kicks in. It's not a sudden change. It just over about 2 bars, it goes from straight to the change I mean. It's in the solo, and it's almost they're working so tightly on the machine. You can imagine them in the studio. I can imagine them looking at each other, and they're just, okay, now we swing, and it just grows into this. It's not like a bomb bomb the next beat. It just morphs into this perfect swing, and you can imagine those early days, the crowd just jumping, and obviously for years afterwards, jumping on their feet as again, it just makes it so interesting. Go from straight to a swung rhythm, makes the solo interesting, makes the notes sound more interesting, and you can, for me, I can really feel Rossi's. He's really feeding off the rhythm of the band, the rhythm section. Makes his solos, which aren't particularly exotic or fancy type, it just makes them interesting. Like I said before, I could sing or whistle probably every note of that solo. Getting back to the solo, one thing I think is really great on this as well, before we go into the fast bit, that's in unison with Alan Lancaster on the bass. Yeah, it's really fast. it's not easy to play. Again, yeah, Lancaster not really credited for being a technically proficient bass player, but yeah, he really was. He had all the chops. I listened. I could say I listened to this earlier this afternoon, and it just seemed that what it was on. I think the Deluxe album goes on for quite a long time, hour and 23. But I think the original version was it one, two, three, four, about 8 tracks, probably only 40 minutes, probably 45 minutes, and it went by, blink of an eye. It was so exciting to listen to. Um, so yeah, 4,500 times I could listen to it all day or long. I could listen to 20-minute versions, um, 10-minute versions, 5-minute original version, whatever. And I do really like the piano on this, as you mentioned. That guy that played on it before, I forgot his name that you said.
John Mealing.
John Mealing, yeah. And there's a real nice. He's really Parfit and the piano player really they represent the chords with each other. Goes from an E to a D and but as it puts the major third in there as well. Really nice little bluesy passage, which really lifts it. Sounds really, really good.
Yeah.
Sound is an understatement.
My favourite section of this, and I can never remember whether this was in there from the start, is that section where they start to wind down somewhat and you hear them go da 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 da, and it just gets faster and faster before Rossi does that da 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 da, and then it goes off into a Rick special. And to me, every piece of recorded Quo material, that is the essence of Quo right there. When I saw them do it, certainly on Blu-ray, when they did it on the second tour, when they redid the 4,500 times and added bits, that was one of the bits that was in there. And when I saw that for the first time, I cried because I was like, that's such a throwback to those early days and that sort of 1970s sound. That is the sound of Status Quo in my mind. Do you know the bit I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do exactly. I know exactly what you mean. And there's no shame in saying you cried at a gig because you talk about we talked earlier on about my early memories of this, and I'm a fair bit older than you, but when they put those bits in, when you see it live later on, it might be 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, it takes you back to that first time you heard it, and your heroes are playing it live in front of you. And it's very powerful emotions coming out. These songs have been with me. This band has been with me since I was a kid. My brother played with me in the band. My mom was a big fan of them. My dad was a big fan of them. It's my sister as well. My mom originally was the Quo kind of turned her on to rock music really because originally it was kind of like, oh, Iain, you're playing your loud music. Turn it down, turn your guitar down. And eventually she came to a Quo gig with me at the NEC in Birmingham, and she got into not really heavy stuff, but like the Eagles, and she liked a bit of AC/DC and particularly Quo and Black Crows and things like this. And it does take you back. Like I said before, this band just mean a lot more to me than just the albums. Family concerts going together and the traveling and when a new album comes out, you're excited to it. You're saving up your money. We ask your mom for the money when you're a kid. You haven't got any money. They have a really big impact. So I can totally see why years later, we're talking about Rossi plays a couple of notes on his guitar, but it's not that time. Then just it takes you back to how it all started, and fantastic.
Definitely, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. And the thing is, I think this album is probably sold loads of tickets to their live show. I feel like the first time they played Caroline was at Reading in 1973. I can't remember exactly. I think that is it. I'm sure I've heard a bootleg of that.
Yeah, there's interesting on this live version. There's a bootleg, well, not bootleg. There's a live version of "Don't Waste My Time" at Reading, which is really aggressive and in your face. It sounds brilliant. And there's a few bum notes from Parfit on it, which I never heard him do before. But I think these are the days when they were living rock and roll to the full. So I'm sure some gigs there was a bit of booze, a bit of dope flying around. So I think there could be some exuberance they can be forgiven for. But 4,500 times. What a track! It's one of those ones that I never get bored of. I remember years ago, actually, funny enough, doing a band room. There was a fan convention in where was it? Somewhere in Wales, Real, real, was it real? Anyway, we'd set up to do the sound check, and early in the afternoon, and there's 4 or 5 bands on, a bit like the Butlins thing, but wasn't at Butlins. And we'd gone out to get something to eat and sort of come back and have a bit of a break from the gig. And they're playing Quo all day long, and sometimes it's a bit like, you've got Quo bands playing, they're playing Quo songs all day. And it was a bit, okay, I need perhaps a little break from this for 20 minutes. So we went outside, had something to eat. Anyway, we came back in a couple of hours later. I remember the room was full of Quo fans, and they had 4,500 times on, and it was loud, and everyone was headbanging air guitar playing. And we walked in, it was just the best feeling. Yeah, they played all songs all afternoon, but this just, it's probably like, the light was going down, it was darker in the room, probably 6, 7 o'clock before the bands came on. It just lit up the crowd. So 4,500 times deserves to live on as a rock classic. Absolutely.
Definitely so. Let's talk about the B-side to Caroline that came out around this time, and certainly on the 2005 version of Hello that I've got. I do own it on vinyl as well. They have that B-side which is called Joanne, which again almost sounds like it came from the same time, same idea as And It's Better Now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you know what? I don't know why. I've never heard this song. I've seen it as a B-side to Caroline, and for some reason I've never heard it. I know it tonight, and I've got to be honest. Well, I tried to be constructive. It sounds like a 60s pop doo-wop song. It really didn't fit with this album. It sounded really disjointed. It had really Everly Brothers type vocals on it, which I know Ross was a big fan of. The production sounded really 60s, and the guitar playing was really, we talked earlier on about not being sure. The guitar solos had a really wishy-washy sound. Not a fan at all. It just didn't.
I know what you mean. It's like a Hank Marvin type sound to those lead lines.
Absolutely. Do you know what? That's what exactly I thought. It sounded like the Shadows were the backing band. It sounded a bit limp, a bit clean, a bit nice. It's like, I'm sure I'm glad it wasn't on the original album, because it would have ruined it. After 4,500 times, put that on. It's good to have the extra tracks, but it was a real mismatch from Hello. That could have been on more of a like a not even a Mark Kelly's spare parts type. That's where it seems to fit for me, really.
Yes, I think so. Or maybe they could have done a Lennon and McCartney and given it away to somebody.
Yeah. I think it didn't. It's normally Quo songs sound like Quo, whatever they do, whether it's a country sort of riff or, I mean, there's things I love. For example, off In the Army Now, there's they had an Invitation, beautiful country song. It sounds like Quo still somehow, but Joanne doesn't sound like them at all, really, for me. Something I won't be listening to again, I'm afraid.
No, it is. Again, it's another skipper for me. When I used to have it on my iPod, and you'd have like this Quo playlist, and it would just show you all the Quo stuff, and I always end up skipping that one. And I feel like I would have it in chronological order, so the next track would be Backwater. So, of course, a little bit more on the Quo trail.
Yeah.
Would you say this is the quintessential essential Status Quo album?
I think it really was. I mean, I said before, I listened to it again today in its entirety, and just the track list, how they just hit you, to have Caroline halfway through, just absolute blow your head off. Yeah, I think if you had to say somebody, choose me one album, who's Status Quo? Because weirdly, Power Drive is probably a little bit more diverse than it says. It's like slower blues tracks. Hello from start to finish, probably apart from And It's Better Now, is absolute gold. Absolute gold. Yeah, it really is. It's the one I would happy to play, proud to play to anybody. And it would certainly how to describe how Status Quo sounded at their pomp, at their most electric, their most on fire. And obviously it was probably the most creative times as well that they've said, haven't they? The 70s particularly was for them. The majority of their hits were really made, and the most exciting times.
So that is Hello, which is 50 this year. I've done a few podcasts on the album. Recently also talked about this album with Gary Davies from Quo, so you can go and check that out as well. Thank you, Iain, for being on the podcast today, and please do come back, because your insight into the kind of inner musical theory of it is fascinating.
Oh, good. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Jamie. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm glad you find it interesting, because I like talking about it. Even if some people it might bore them, I'm sure there's some people out there it gives a slightly different perspective on the on the technical side of the playing, which is I think should have a spotlight shone on it because it's definitely there, and people probably don't give them the credit they deserve. So thank you once again. It was great chatting to you.